Welcome back to Esther Alexis' Body of an Extrovert. Today's episode is entitled Two Truths and a Lie. Today's episode I'm hoping will be an icebreaker for those who are unaware or confused by the Black Lives Matter movement. See, the game is usually used in order to introduce people to others that they don't know in hopes of getting to know them better so that they may work together in unison and be comfortable in doing so. Right now, you're probably hearing of a lot of racial tensions running high in the United States, particularly regarding police brutality and people of color. There are a lot of people that actually don't know what's been happening, and now it just looks like chaos. I'm hoping that this episode will be able to shed light for those who don't know, enlighten you, and even lead you to ask questions, because that's how you get knowledge. So before I begin, I think it's very important to say that I am not a spokesperson for anyone aside from myself. That the conclusions that I may have may not be the conclusions, the solutions, the opinions that others share, and they might be in the same movement that I am. And that just goes to show you that it's a multifaceted thing. It's still growing, and it's still needed. So what we're going to talk about right now is what the Black Lives Matter movement is really about. For some time now, for a long time now, it seems as though unarmed Black boys and girls are being killed at a higher rate. I believe the statistic is 3.5 times more likely than white counterparts who are also unarmed. We see this in the news every day. We think of Trayvon Martin, who was coming home from a corner store and was chased and then killed. We think of Eric Garner, who was selling CDs, who didn't have anything on him and was killed. The most recent names that we're hearing now are Breonna Taylor, who was killed in her own home. She was a praised EMT and was shot 8 times, although the police apparently already had their suspect in custody and were at the wrong address. George Floyd was killed essentially what feels like on national TV and was doing that, or was apprehended because he was supposedly writing a bad check. You see, the Black Lives Matter movement is focused on ending police brutality against people of color who shouldn't have to be killed, to be brought to justice, or shouldn't have had to be in those situations whatsoever. You see, there's this common misconception that if I believe one thing is true and you believe something else is true, then one of us have to be wrong. And to be honest, I don't think that that's true. What am I referring to, you ask? Well, right now, I'm referring to people who are either being very silent right now about what's going on, or speaking a little too much about what's going on when they themselves have never experienced it or have very little connection to it. So the first truth that I'm going to share is that you can be pro-Black and you can be pro-America. There's a lot of talk right now that these protests are very anti-American and anti-police and anti-government and all these things. And I have to say that that really confuses and confounds me. If America's a melting pot, how is supporting one group of people that has been oppressed, how is supporting the equal treatment of a group of people considered anti-American? I mean, the United States for years has been touted as a country of promise and opportunity for people of all backgrounds and colors. And yet when people point out that they're not being given a chance at life, let alone those opportunities, how is that anti-American? Wouldn't any system that threatens that promise, or rather the constitutional rights promised to every citizen, wouldn't that be anti-American? The behavior, or rather the cruel and unusual punishment dealt out by an American system, namely the police, has been un-American. And you can refer to your 8th Amendment in the Constitution to verify that. Yet and still, we're hearing arguments such as that doesn't make every police officer bad. And I agree with you. However, if you don't call out injustice, aren't you a perpetrator of justice? Let's use the good and bad apples metaphor that we're hearing a lot nowadays. There's a lot of talk, well, there are a few bad apples and, and they've slipped through the cracks. Okay, let's stick to fruit then. Have you ever had a rotten apple with mold, the little white fuzzies growing on the side? And have you ever put it next to a brand new fresh apple? What happens to that brand new fresh apple? It takes very little. As a matter of fact, it takes less time for that apple to become rotten as well. You see, that apple hasn't been out as long as the other apple. Just by being around that poisonous fruit, just by being around that mold and taking no action, the other apple simply does nothing and by association is rotted. You see, there's a quote that says that the only way that evil wins is when good men do nothing. I can't speak to the intentions of every police officer. The fact is, everywhere you go, you're going to find bad people. However, for everyone arguing that there's so many good police officers, it just seems as though they're never around when a bad officer is doing something. What I'm trying to say is that inaction is just as bad as action. If you see or hear evil and do nothing against it, you're an accomplice to that evil. You too begin to rot. Your silence, your action is aiding and abetting. And that's the problem. A great example of this would be in this past week, a senior citizen who was protesting was pushed down. His head was essentially busted wide open. An officer tried to stop and help him momentarily, only for another officer colleague of his to say, no, don't. And then what seemed like a barrage of good officers following orders walked right past that man. When both of those officers were put on leave without pay, 57 officers resigned. You see, the thing is, it's hard to believe that there are just a few bad apples in the system when instead of speaking up against one injustice, 57 would rather leave than speak up against the one wrong thing that happened. Another truth is that you can be someone who is not racist and contribute to perpetuating racism. In simpler terms, if you're not anti-racist, then the fact is you're part of the problem. If you have friends, family members, colleagues, or associates that are comfortable spewing racism or racist rhetoric in your presence, then your stance hasn't been made clear. Having a black friend, a partner, or associate, or what have you, that doesn't make you an ally. Speaking against all forms of racism, passive and active, even when your colored counterparts aren't there, that makes you an ally. Doing the right thing when no one is there makes you an ally. Please understand and hear me when I say that this video will not be about bashing cops. What it is trying to do is enlighten you to what's happening and why the perspective is as skewed as it is. I more than anyone want to believe that the people that we are paying with our tax dollars to protect us are doing just that. But the fact is, the statistics, the facts, the videos don't say that. And that's why it's become so hard for so many people of color to believe that aside from the fact that there are a few bad apples, that there's a system in place that supports those bad apples, and that maybe it's just the silence, but it's a system that becomes deaf when it's time to listen to the cries of a particular community. Another truth is that you can be someone who isn't racist and still contribute to perpetuating racism. In simpler terms, if you're not anti-racist, then you're part of the problem. If you have friends, family members, colleagues, or associates that are comfortable spewing racist rhetoric around you, then you've not made your stance clear enough. Having a black friend, a black partner, or what have you does not make you an ally. Speaking against all forms of racism, both passive and active, that makes you an ally. Speaking against it when no colored counterparts are there, that makes you an ally. Doing the right thing when no one is there, that makes you an ally. Making it known that you don't tolerate it and that you'll not only rebuke it but actively act against it, that makes you an ally. The thing is, a lot of people avoid uncomfortable conversation, but I'm kind of wondering if avoiding that uncomfortable conversation and that necessary confrontation is what's led to all of this, trying to keep the peace. Well, now it's contributed to unrest, and it makes us all part of the issue, whether it's us not speaking out when we were made uncomfortable, or our allies not having those uncomfortable conversations with their friends, with the people that they're able to network with. The fact is, what we're witnessing right now, what many people would term as chaos, is actually just the world through the perspective of a person of color. In fact, the reason why so many people are disgruntled is that for the first time, you're seeing what Black boys and girls see every single day. You're seeing the people that you pay to protect you harm you, brutalize you, and then blame you. You're looking through the lens of color, and as uncomfortable as it makes you, it's our reality. Most everyone I know, no matter how they identify politically, religiously, culturally, have people of color in their circle. People that they would call friends and family. And the fact is that this is what your friends and family are going through. You see, I think a lot of people have disillusioned themselves into thinking that this only happens to the ones that commit crime. No, it actually happens to every single one of us. They might not be killed on national television, but they're quietly tailed in department stores. They're subtly told that they can't afford to be in the spaces that they inhabit. They're lowballed in professional spaces, although they oftentimes have the higher degree and more experience. They go unbelieved and unheard in medical or healthcare spaces, and they're underestimated in the classroom and encouraged to keep quiet and behave. Those same friends are the ones given the backhanded compliments like, "You're so beautiful for a Black boy or guy," or "Wow, you don't even sound Black," as if we all sound one particular kind of way that might lead other people to believe that we all just sound uneducated. Essentially, they're encouraged to die quietly, and their narratives are written for them before they've even had a chance to introduce themselves. Quite frankly, if I had a nickel, not a dime, but a nickel for every time someone told me how different I am in comparison to the person that they thought I was before having even met me, I'd at least be able to pay off my student loans 6 times over. And here's the lie: that this is a political war, that this is a race war, that it's an agenda. Whether it's the media or our environment, there have been a number of labels assigned to this movement: un-American, liberal, anti-white, anti-police. The list is endless. But I have to tell you that that's actually just divisive and wildly untrue. I don't have to belong to any political party to say that what has happened over the course of this year, just pick a month and find a name associated with it. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others was wrong. I don't have to be a historian to know that the killing of innocent people of color is something that's almost been a protected right in this country, and one that needs to be addressed and stopped. There are so many people that think that the government or the laws put in place by our government should be a guide as to how we should act as decent human beings, or a guide to our morality. And the fact is, it's not. Never forget that the most inhumane acts in human history were legal until people found the courage to say enough is enough. Want a few examples? The Holocaust was legal. Apartheid in South Africa was legal. Slavery was legal. Segregation was legal. Somehow in history, the victims of oppression were criminalized and the oppressive institutions legalized. You see, the fact is, if we don't know our history, we're bound to repeat it. We know better and we have to do better. And that begins with acknowledging the issue and speaking out against it. And that leads us to protesting. Why are there so many protests? Why have they taken such violent courses? The fact is that I want everyone to understand that protesters, looters, and rioters are not necessarily in the same camp. Just because people take advantage of these protests, the mass numbers, and they use this time to loot and riot, those people are actually different from the protesters. Well, how do you know, Esther? Most of the people actually arrested in Minneapolis and St. Paul, the Twin Cities, where it really all began, 80%, not 10, not 20, not 30, but 80% of those people weren't even from that area and didn't make up the protesters. These people had come in trucks, in masks, in defensive gear. Who wears all of that to a peaceful protest? They're usually not in the same camp. That's my point. So let's not lump them all together. How do you protest, and how do you protest peacefully? Many different organizers have done it in ways that haven't been as publicized as the looters and the rioters. After all, media is going to put on what gets, the clickbait, what gets the most views. The fact is, there have been more peaceful protests than harmful protests. You just wouldn't know if you didn't look it up. The fact is that protesting looks different for everyone. It can be as simple as donating, marching, organizing, or simply speaking out against racism when you see it. You see, a lot of people think that right now, if you're not posting, if you're not sharing, if you're not actively saying or doing something, then your silence is, an accomplice. And to some extent, that's not necessarily untrue. However, you decide what your protest is. If it means correcting your grandmother who has racist rhetoric, just running around rampant in her house, then do that. Have that conversation with her. If it's organizing a protest of your own, then do that. It could be 2 or 3 people. It doesn't have to be this huge thing. It just has to get the conversation started. I know that a lot of us are really disappointed in the year 2020. Quite frankly, I get it. However, there's a quote that's running around right now, and it's one that I'm really holding on to for hope. What if 2020 isn't canceled? What if 2020 is actually the year we've all been waiting for? A year so uncomfortable, a year so raw, so scary that it's forcing us to move. It's forcing us to change. It's forcing people to listen and forcing others to speak. Maybe 2020 is the year of change. Change doesn't happen where we're comfortable. It happens where we're uncomfortable. And change begins at home. This has been your icebreaker, your introduction to the cause. What are you going to do about it?